This is a Steam Deck. This is a Nintendo Switch. This is a Nintendo Switch Lite. This is the RG28XX by Anbernic, aka the Honcho. And this is Anbernic's new RG28XX, and it is the first micro handheld I've ever used. If it isn't obvious, this thing is tiny, small even. I mean, the Honcho was already pretty small. I would say it's a fairly pocketable device, and yet the RG28XX is much smaller. Well, noticeably smaller. It's a pretty neat and unique little device, obviously sort of going for that form factor of the Game Boy Micro. I never owned a Game Boy Micro, so I don't know how it compares, but the important thing is that this itself is very nice to use. It has a 2.8-inch IPS display, hence the 28XX. This has a 3.5-inch display, hence the 35XX. If you didn't know that, that's kind of how Anbernic names their devices. It's got the same all-winner H700 processor that you'll find in the RG35XX, H Plus and SP and so on, and it's a 640 by 480 screen. It's 480p, which is going to look very sharp on a 2.8-inch screen. The screen has a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is going to make it great for playing most retro games. And this particular model that was sent to me by Banggood.com has a 64GB micro SD card pre-installed with the operating system and about 5,000 games preloaded. So yeah, full disclosure, this was sent to me by Banggood.com, and I will have an affiliate link in the description where I've got to refer you to them over there. Currently they're having a summer sale which is about to end in just a couple of days as of me posting this video. Currently it's $61.99 for the 64GB version I have here, or right now you can pay an extra $5 to get the 64GB version with an additional 128GB SD card, bringing it to over 10,000 games. It's available in the Game Boy style gray with red buttons, transparent black with Xbox style buttons, a bright orange color with white buttons, or this kind of creamy off-white color with the purple buttons. It kind of makes me think of Mewtwo. Am I crazy in that? Does that not look like Mewtwo? You've got a D-pad and start and select on the left, your face buttons and single speaker on the right. Along the top you've got 4 shoulder buttons, 2 of which are easier to use and 2 of which are harder to use because they're a little bit flush, but they're still pretty usable. You've got a mini HDMI port, the menu button, and your USB-C charging port. Along the bottom you've got a headphone jack, a micro SD card slot for the operating system and some games, and for additional games you've got a second micro SD card. As I mentioned, this one has a 64GB SD card, and per usual I recommend getting a brand name SD card and putting everything onto that instead of the one that comes with it, because most of the ones that are included with these things are prone to failure. And then on one side here we have the volume rocker, and along the right you have your power button and reset button. This has a 3100 mAh battery, which should give you about 8 hours of battery life, give or take. Depending on the games you're playing, it may be closer to 4. It doesn't really have a true sleep mode, so the battery will drain over time if you leave it asleep without turning it off, but I did leave it on overnight with about 3 bars left on the battery and woke up with it at 1 bar left, so it's not something that dies overnight like past devices I've used like the Miyoo Mini Plus. At the home screen here you have Anbernic's newer software. It's pretty similar to the old software but just a bit different. It almost looks like they kind of modeled it around how Garlic OS looks, but this does not have Garlic OS. You got your game rooms, which will bring you to your different emulators. Personally, I wouldn't really recommend using the game rooms section. Instead, I would go with RA Game, which is RetroArch. This is where you're going to find a few more systems, including Dreamcast, and the options and settings and everything, the performance, it's all just going to be a bit better in RetroArch, so I recommend just staying away from the game rooms tab unless you absolutely want to. Just go with RetroArch. This thing plays a ton of systems. You got PSP, Dreamcast, PS1, different arcade stuff, Pokemon Mini Console, Pico 8, Atari, Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo, Super Nintendo. This thing does play N64, but out of the box, N64 is absent. So if you pick one of these up and you don't see N64, that's because they don't have any ROMs installed, but it will still play N64. If you plug the micro SD card into your computer, you will see an N64 folder. You just drag some ROMs into that, and the N64 icon will appear on this page. Yeah, except for some reason my SD card that comes with this thing is not being read by either my Mac or my Windows PC. I tried to assign a letter in Windows Disk Management and it wasn't appearing. I don't know what's wrong. It works, it's plugged into this thing and it's working in here, but for some reason my computer won't read it, and so I cannot add any N64 ROMs or any ROMs to this thing to test it out unless I find another SD card. I don't know if I have another one to spare right now, and I gotta get this video out. So you can play N64. I Just can't. Now you may notice, however, that this thing does not have a thumbstick. It only has the D-pad. So it's not going to be great for systems or games that rely on a thumbstick like N64 or Dreamcast. If you absolutely want to play N64 and you really want a thumbstick, just go with the Honcho. It's still very pocketable. It's a little more expensive and not quite as tiny as this little micro guy here. Speaking of the D-pad is small, but it's not terrible to use. It actually works really nicely. There's no accidental diagonals, and you're able to pull off different commands in fighting games and whatnot pretty easily. The face buttons are also very small. They're much smaller than you would find on the Honcho here, but I would say they're pretty usable. So far, the size of the buttons has yet to be an issue for me. The shoulder buttons on this thing rattle like crazy. It's like noticeably loud. It's not a huge deal for me. I mean, personally, I'm not shaking this thing. I'm playing games on it, so if it is a big deal to you, that's something to keep in mind. It's pretty rattly. As far as comfort goes, this thing is going to be fairly comfortable for its size considering it's a horizontal handheld. I would still say this is probably better for shorter gaming sessions. This is a device you're going to take with you in your pocket, maybe throw it into a bag or whatnot. But if you do see yourself wanting to use this thing for an hour or so at a time, this horizontal form factor is going to make it not so bad to use for that amount of time. This is going to be a great device for grinding in RPGs. The text may be a little small in some games depending on your eyesight. For me though, it's been perfectly usable. This thing I would say is probably the perfect portable Pokemon machine. It's tiny, it's pocketable, you can take it with you on the go, pull it out when you're waiting at the dentist's office or something, catch a couple Pokemon, and move on with your day. Speaking of Pokemon, take a look at this. This is what was included on the 64GB version. As far as what comes with the 128GB version, I don't know. I don't have that one. Now I'm not sure if this thing can emulate DS, but I think that it can. It has the same chipset as the Honcho, and that can emulate DS, but I can't imagine that trying to play DS on a 2.8-inch screen is going to be very much fun. I mean, go for it if you feel like you want to, but I would definitely recommend probably just sticking to Game Boy and Game Boy Advance when it comes to catching Pokemon. Strangely, even though this has the same chipset as the Honcho, it feels like performance has taken a little bit of a dip here. PSP works pretty okay. The screen is going to be squished horizontally because it's not the right aspect ratio, and I couldn't really figure out how to get it to the correct aspect ratio for PSP, which is going to make things look even smaller because it would squish down and have black bars along the top and bottom. But games like Mega Man X Maverick Hunter, which usually run pretty well, actually had some frame drops on this thing. But for older systems up to PS1, it's going to work pretty well. The screen is really nice. Again, I know it's only 480p, but it feels like it doesn't need the word only in that sentence when you're talking about a 2.8-inch screen. Everything looks very sharp. If they were going to try to cram more pixels into this thing, I don't know that you would really be able to tell a difference in pixel density considering the screen is so small, and considering most of the games you're going to be playing look like this. When going through game lists, you can hit the start button to add a game to your favorites, and along the home screen if you go to the favorites menu, obviously those games are going to appear here. Next to that, you're going to have history, where you'll see the different games that you've played recently, and then you'll have search, where obviously you can search for the different games you want to play. I recommend using search because it's going to make things much easier to find when you've got so many games, especially if you get that 128GB version that's going to have over 10,000 games. That's a lot of games to sift through. So if you're looking for specific games, definitely use that search function. When you do use the search, most games are going to appear twice. That's because you have the game rooms and the RA section, the RetroArch section. So along the top of the screen, you'll see RA pop up, and that's the RetroArch version. So if you're trying to stick to RetroArch, make sure you launch the RA version so that you're playing the RetroArch version of that ROM. You then have an app section where you have a music player, a video player, an ebook reader. So if you want to read ebooks on this tiny little screen, you can do that. And then you've got a file manager and something called Expert, which has this, and I don't know what it does, so I'm not going to mess with it, but it's there. Clearly, I'm not an expert. And then you've got your different settings you can adjust. You've got your date and time, your language settings, your RetroArch settings, and so on. You can even change the look of this thing by changing the icons. And if you prefer the classic look of Anbernic's UI for some reason, you can go back to that. I'm gonna go back to the new one though. I like the new one. By default, there's also this annoying button sound option, where you can hear every beep and bloop as you're pressing buttons. Fortunately, in the settings, you can just turn that right off. Yep. And now it's gone. Now the witch is vanquished. Speaking of volume, the sound is actually pretty decent for having one speaker, and it gets pretty loud. My only issue here is that the volume rocker is very flush, so it's actually kind of hard to press at a time. Sometimes I have to press the button a few times for it to actually make the adjustment. Now for you out of the box folks, which is most of you guys that watch these videos on my channel, as far as this 64GB version is concerned, it comes with a lot of really great games, but some noticeable omissions. There are no Mario games whatsoever, and like I mentioned, N64 is nowhere to be seen out of the box. And then you've got games like Chrono Trigger not included. PS1 is pretty bare, as is PSP, but again, it is only a 64GB version, and those games are going to take up the most space. So yeah, this is the RG28XX, and I really like it. It's not something that would be my primary device, but when I really want a small device that I can take with me on the go to catch some Pokemon, this is probably going to be one of my go-tos for that. For my first micro handheld, I gotta say I'm pleasantly surprised and impressed. For some, this may be a little bit too small. You do kind of have to keep in mind there's a reason they call it a micro handheld. It's gonna be pretty small. I mean, I gave you that size comparison in the beginning with all those different devices, so that should give you an idea of just how tiny this thing really is. I mean, look at it in my meat hooks. Look at these meat hooks. Look at these Hulk hands compared to this thing. I mean, say what you will about my Shrek hands. This thing's nice. I'm a big fan. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to Banggood.com for sending this out for review. Now I will have another review for another micro device very similar to this one where I may do some comparisons. So yeah, stick around for that. Make sure you're subscribed. That should be coming fairly soon after I get a couple other videos out of the way. Yeah, that's all the time I have for now. Thank you guys again for watching. Here's some other videos if you'd like to watch those. Make sure to subscribe if you're new, like the video, comment, and so on. I'm out of here. Okay, bye.